Hi everyone, welcome back to our game development theory videos. Now this time we're going to be talking about the number of players, another one of our basic game characteristics. Relatively simple and in some places very self-explanatory, but worth talking about just in case to make sure we understand the different types. We're going through one half of it today and we'll be looking at the other half in a future video. So number of players is of course a very important thing to define when you start talking about a game, because of course you want to know whether it's one player, whether you can play it with one friend or many friends. There's lots of different things you need to be aware of, especially these days where there's so much more opportunity to have many players in a game, or to have very specific one player experiences, but both important to know before you start. Now, one quick definition that's not actually going to be much in use today, but in a future video, is multiplayer. Now, multiplayer does not generally include two players, which is a different sort of focus. Multiplayer is almost always used when you're talking about three or more players. We'll talk more about multiplayer in the future, but for now, just recognise three or more players is what multiplayer is called. So we'll start with 0 players. Now, observation games are where 0 players come in. Now, there's arguments about whether they're really games and etc. etc. But we're not talking about that today. We're just sort of noting them. You do get games, sort of parody games that sort of take on this, where it's almost like a video you watch of a game being played. You get things like idle games, which very literally you're generally watching numbers rise and have very little input, so there's an argument there whether you are actually playing the game or sort of facilitating a menu for the game to be played. It's an interesting take. And there's one game I found called Raindrop Races, where you don't play the game, you observe it completely. So you choose 2 raindrops on the windowsill and they race, and you sort of watch who wins. Again, you have no impact on that game because you're merely observing it, so technically it's 0 players. 0 human players anyway, there's 2 raindrop players, but that's not what we're talking about. So 0 players, again, the titles are very self-explanatory. Pure 1 player is where you're playing against the system. So you're not going against a simulated human or an actual human. It's literally playing against the system. So one example, the classic, is Tetris. Because Tetris, you're not fighting another person who has a similar Tetris setup. The blocks are there, you are making the situation. The rules dictate whether you win or lose, and knock out your line of tetronimos. And yeah, so you're very literally playing against the system, and there's no sort of player-like elements. You're not going against another player at all. Then we get simulated opponents. This is one we're very aware of. So if you've ever played most games, in fact, where there's any kind of opponent that's not human controlled, say Diablo or World of Warcraft, in sort of the AI opponents, or you get Smash Bros going through the campaign rather than playing friends or online. And Mario, because in Mario it's not just platforming, there's also enemies and bosses to contend with. So all of those things are simulated opponents. It's also called 1.5 players, because though you are 1 player, there is another player. It just happens to be a computer AI who's doing everything. So one of the interesting parts about there is the half player, because of course difficulty comes into it, because you are playing against the system. And though that's a longer video for another time, it's worth noting that the difficulty is set by what the computer is coded to do, because technically the computer has a superhuman sort of micromanagement. It can click on as many things as it wants to very quickly, far faster than human speed anyway. However, it will have limited strategies. There's no point being able to click on absolutely everything on a board if you can't then find a suitable strategy to win or offer some kind of a competition. So that the difficulty balances those. So simulated opponents, the half player. We then get 2 player. This is very self-explanatory. This is the classic. So anything from like Tekken and chess, And it also starts to branch into multiplayer, so you also get things like, so you have, say, basketball or Quake or something like that, where you can play it 2-player, but you can also play it as a multiplayer, 3 players and more. So 2-player, also it's a far more pure experience when you're having 1 versus 1 human. When you go into multiplayer, sort of more political play starts to come along, but that's for the next video. Two-sided. This is a better term generally for describing certain situations, because technically a 2-player game is a 2-sided game. There's one side versus another side. But a 2-sided game can also be Overwatch or League of Legends or any of those types of games where there are multiple players, but there are 2 sides, one side versus the other. One-sided is basically one team of players versus the system. You might get a World of Warcraft raid boss, or even Dungeons and Dragons to some extent, where the system is the dungeon master, that one player who's controlling everything, and everyone else is trying to team up against the challenges there. So one-sided is another term you should be aware of. Now, one interesting thing that comes in when you start having more than 2 players is politics, and this is one bit I did want to talk about before we go into multiplayer fully next time, is king-making. Now, king-making is a very interesting situation where if you have a player who's basically in an impossible situation to win, often they then dictate who is going to win, who is going to come into first place. A nice little summary I read was, although I cannot win, my actions determine who will, which is interesting. So one example would be Mario Kart, where the timing of a lightning item or a blue shell item can severely hinder who is coming in first. I mean those are literally made to do that. But you can see then that the person in first and second and third, so everyone in the front, is actually still very much controlled by the person in last, who has all the power to take all these sort of larger amounts. That's a very sort of exaggerated example. There's lots of other situations. So Monopoly, where you're losing out to your opponents, and you have to pay someone or someone else, or someone offers you a bid for property that allows them to get a set. That would be an example of king making, because the person who actually has the least has that little bit to offer the victor that bit to go a bit further and win. It also brings in sort of the idea of politics, so the person who's doing last might have sort of revenge for actions that have come along previously. Okay, so only a short video today, but just to sort of get you thinking about the terms. But there's a couple of tasks I'd like you to try. So first, just give some examples of each of the types of games, just to make sure you're sort of on the right level with it and understand the different terms from today. And the second one is more sort of an open thinking one. So is a 0-player game actually a game? How can we define it as such? It's a bit of an open question, but I'd certainly like you to have a think about it and see, is a game that you do not participate in still actually a game? An interesting one. Okay, next time we're talking about multiplayer and the different terms in there. I'll see you next time.